just like the Renaissance made everyone an entrepreneur, a capitalist, right? You're owning your own land. So even if you're farming, you're still responsible for it now for the first time. So too, all of these things that you were almost, doing, through kind of billable tickets. Now you have decisions about not values, design, construction, but also how you the economic risks you take, right? With these new tools, you can participate in fractionalized ownership of the product you can create. You can choose to participate in downstream revenue, right? And so like these, now you can say, hey, do I want all of it up front, or do I want to hold part of it back for downstream revenue over time because I think my work will accrue value over time?
So do you think we are starting a complete shift in how we perceive ownership and identity and participation in community? And where do you see this, if you take that historical thread, where do you see it ultimately ending up? Sort of what is the watermark or the high watermark of this renaissance?
The internet and digital economy is, we think of it as our de facto given, but it's only been 40, 50 years and a meaningful concept. And so that's just like a tick of the clock. And part of the reason we divorced ownership from creation and consumption and community participation was because we didn't have the technical rails to do that. Although we could communicate finance in a distributed way and even publish communication, we didn't have ownership. We didn't have property contract mechanisms, either for real IRL assets or for synthetic assets. And so now with crypto, this ledger-based technology, you can call them NFTs, but they're not just pictures of pixelated cats. They're actually strong property rights of ownership for physical and synthetic assets. And so that allows us to essentially re-weld, ownership tied to participation. Once you do that, once individuals are in charge of their ownership, they're no longer handing it over to someone for authentication or credentials. Once creators actually persist that ownership and they can communicate with communities directly without mediation, that opens up all sorts of generative business models. And these kind of historical transformations tend to unfold in two phases. The first is the same thing as what we'd seen before, but better, faster, cheaper. And then the second phase is, the unimaginable, the things that wouldn't have otherwise been possible without these technological rails. And so for kind of consumers and studio people and people creating brands, in Web2, the reason I mentioned a bit of that background was just from firsthand experience. The value of what you created, your company or your community, was really in the code, right? That was everything else. You essentially handed over identity and participation to people who would harvest that through these algorithms. But you've essentially handed over your identity, your social graph. You can't get that back or reinstantiate it. And so now with being able to persist that as ownership, that opens up all sorts of possibilities that wouldn't have been otherwise possible in a generative function. Not just taking from TAM, where throughout the 90s it's been about aggregating markets and monopoly or duopoly, but this actually gives business models for all sorts of esoteric interests along the long tail of the distribution curve. And part of that is because the value isn't in the code. The code for most Web3 or crypto is forkable, which means imagine if you could cut and paste Google's source code, right? Like that's crazy. But that's how crypto works. Uniswap has code, SushiSwap, it's not meeting community demand. SushiSwap creates a new product, Uniswap comes back and meets those demands. And so now the value is in the community, the content, the brand, the association. And so that's where essentially, you and your audience have kind of been laboring in this medieval world where you work and, someone else is harvesting the fruits of your work, right? It's not, you can maybe buy their stock, but it's not directly coupled. And so where I see this going is a redistribution of ownership, a decentralization of not just technology, but also value aggregation, and finally having business models that support these kind of weird esoteric interests or odd ideas, which historically are the most interesting. You don't need to post and have 10 million people like it and get $1.76 from YouTube and 0 from Twitter. Now all of a sudden you can have a viable business around not just 10,000 people or 1,000 people, but even 100 people. And you as a consumer now it's more fluid. You can participate through that as well, through things like data DAOs and what have you. You don't hand over your entity, you're your own gatekeeper. And so you can monetize your own data, which sounds like esoteric, but that's how the Web2 economy works. That data is liquid gold. And so now you're creating generation on the creators and their community and the technical rails to make it mutually reinforcing for the first time. So I see a broad unwinding of, hierarchical aggregation from value to communication gating, not just at the platform, but the algorithms of which you're not typically aware that are kind of tamped down until you pay back for that, to like business models that allow esoteric ideas and brands to be financially viable. And like all that is based around brand and community construction instead of just code, because now it's truly open source and composable. So, back to the earlier part of the discussion, we haven't really done it. Part of it is we haven't done a good job of explaining this, but part of it is we're just not there yet. We're only now in this phase where we're starting to unlock that. On one hand, it democratizes the ability to create, but for the people who are into it and good at it, it very much like renews your vocation, like your calling. What do you like and what are you good at? You can pursue those things throughout like a new design space. And what I mean by that is previously you have a model where you basically create something and then someone else is in the middle monetizing it for you, and they give you a fraction of that, right? And so that creates this very static idea where you're trying to create communities by influence and influence them to take a side or an orthogonal action, right? I put out some content. I don't really monetize that. I have to monetize it through billable hours or through a newsletter or through a gate. So then I try to go through the sales funnel, and X% see it, X% take action 1, Y% take action 2, and it all flows out. So someone else is harvesting the fruits, but also my design it's not fun, right? I'm trying to influence people to do things through these secondary means and proxies. And these tools literally allow you to not only have direct economic, access to your community in a generative way, but to design around direct actions. You can actually program those things. That's what we mean by smart contracts. You can persist ownership. You can create 1,000 NFTs and keep 10 of them. You can, carve out downstream rights on this platform. Now, all of a sudden things change in terms of like available upside because you're generating it from the community. So in some sense, like you have not only new design powers, but new economic superpowers. And all of this, to your point, really forces you to clarify who you are and what you're about. Right now it's early, so our UI and UX isn't great. It's kind of difficult, just like it was in the early days of the web, but those things are being built and actually exist in little pieces today. And that, from like a design perspective, if you want to build a brand and create ties of community, you don't have to influence and do it by proxy. You now have a toolkit depending upon how deep you want to go into it. And more of this is being available as, even no coding, right? You can have different, there's a great deal of like no coding coming up. So you don't have to like actually code something. You can hit Olaplex and just publish instantly, or things along those lines. And so like that literally allows you to create these strong ties of community directly, individual to individual, creator to participant. I don't have to go through all these proxies of mediation. If I have a brand and if I want to create a community, have people buy a product or participate, I can actually do that directly now with this new toolbox, right? Like that's unbelievable. It's like a meritocracy, right? So it might be scary for some folks, but if you believe in yourself, it's complete craziness to be able to do that. Just like the Renaissance made everyone an entrepreneur, a capitalist, right? You're owning your own land. So even if you're farming, you're still responsible for it now for the first time. So too, all of these things that you were almost, doing, through kind of billable tickets. Now you have decisions about not values, design, construction, but also how you the economic risks you take, right? With these new tools, you can participate in fractionalized ownership of the product you can create. You can choose to participate in downstream revenue, right? And so like now you can say, hey, do I want all of it up front, or do I want to hold part of it back for downstream revenue over time because I think my work will accrue value over time? Like now it's great. You have this, these sovereignty mechanisms, but it also forces you to think about, your values, where you draw lines, the decisions you make and the trade-offs, but also so too the what you really want to be doing and what bets you're willing to make on yourself and your community.
It kind of forces the designers and the creators to make bold choices, because if you're a music maker and Sony gives you $1 million to make an album and it doesn't work, you're like, oh, I tried, like I'll make another album. If you're getting paid nothing and it's all about the success of the thing you're creating, you approach it in a completely different or new way. And I think also as visual designers, brand designers, you do all the work and then you give it to the client to actually put it into the world. It's like, I'm done. I've done my bit. But now it's like, okay, we need to carry this over that line into the world, connect it to human beings, get them to form an emotional connection, get them to perform whatever action, a purchase, a subscription, sign up, a wallet connection, and then you unlock value, but you do it on a much more profitable or potentially profitable level.
So we run a couple funds, and fund of funds have pretty good visibility into the crypto space with like very, very well-known names from trad Silicon Valley to kind of leading edge folks. And I will tell you, there is a massive bottleneck on people in the space who can design. And so people who are familiar with like Web3 and shops and being able to do this, you're starting to get a lot of cruft out there. But the power of having done this already yourself, even as a shop, much less as a brand, is exponential.
Hello YouTube, I'm Ross Drakes. I'm the founder of Nicework, and thank you so much for your time at watching this video. If you're seeing me, it means you made it all the way to the end, so we've at least done something right. If you enjoyed this, we'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and that thumbs up. It really helps the channel. And I think more important than that is if you know someone who might need to hear this, if you think someone out there who needs this message in their life, please spread the link, because it makes a huge difference to the world, and it allows us to fulfill our message of making sure that there are no more bad brands in the world. Thank you very much, and we'll catch you in the next video.